There are many champions that didn't make it into League of Legends. We're gonna be diving deep into the unreleased champions Iceberg, so watch until the end to see just how crazy the designs get. One of the most unique concepts that was ever worked on is the Shapeshifter. Despite its design being in the works for a while, Ryze Medler was the first to speak about it in a 2015 Q&A post. At first, the champion was supposed to be a swarm of insects that stuck to an ally. It would soak up damage for them and also cast its own spells, all while remaining attached. Because they weren't able to find a fit with the gameplay, they later decided to split up the insect idea from the attaching aspect. But despite all the efforts, they still weren't able to incorporate the insects as they have a hard time fitting in the game. Even if they would make them into something else, like small healing fairies, controlling a swarm of small creatures would be just too awkward. I myself can't imagine playing as a group of bugs or having to face something as potentially annoying as that. And yet, there was still hope for the attaching aspect, as writers wanted to implement it to a support or a tank. They eventually found a fit with yuumi, but it would be better if it stayed stashed away. Similar to this concept, the next one is so unique, it's borderline crazy. The two yordles were designed by Feral Pony, who is also the one that initially revealed the idea. You could only play as one of them at a time, but they could be switched at any moment. The twins would still transform similarly to other shapeshifters like Jace or Elise, but they would differ from each other in terms of their kit. One of them would carry bombs, while the other would have either a rocket launcher or a gun. It's not quite clear. So imagine playing Ziggz, pressing E and suddenly switching to Tristana. As one would think, their kits did not go together all that well. Additionally, it was hard to find the right animation and thematic for such an ambitious project. What is even more interesting is that they were riding on a motorcycle with a sidecar, so one of them would be in control of the wheel and they would switch when told to. We were quite literally able to do a drive-by. Ryze Medler additionally stated that one of them was very fun to play, while the other was pretty generic and boring. It isn't known which one was which, but only a glimpse of the bomber's kit survived, so we can assume he was the cool one. One of his abilities would be similar to Ziggs's W, as it laid a bomb on the ground that activated after some time. But what distinguishes it is the fact that it would work only in a line, for example like Victor Z, and it had to be stepped on to be activated, so it was more like a trap. He also had a familiar ultimate, as it would throw bombs around him, covering a huge area. The idea was later explored with Ivan, which is when they realized that the counterplay is as simple as walking away. That's when they decided to switch it to an ability that later turned into Ziggs's E. Going back to the twin yordle, the most accurate representation of the ultimate would be Hamster's ultimate in Overwatch. The whole bomber concept ended up sticking around, but for what it's known, the other half remains buried. While mentioning Ivan from the previous video, it would also be fitting to mention the two champions that were killed off and put on display with Overdrian. The human is called Tabu the Voodoo Shaman. He was inspired by Dota 2's Witch Doctor, but he does resemble the stereotypical whimsical voodoo magician. He even had his own lore, but it doesn't say much more than that he was a hippie trying to turn a profit by selling skulls. His business ventures weren't successful, but he should have known better and bought Ethereum. All of the information was extracted from the closed beta files, which is where he was also referred to as the 48th slave. I mean, okay, gameplay wise he was a range and charter support, but his kit was oriented more towards using CC abilities rather than directly buffing your AD carry. His passive was just a direct debuff to enemies around him. It reduced their damage dealt if they were in a certain range from Tabu. Here we can already see the first signs of his design philosophy falling apart. His Q, called Tattoo, linked him with another champion for 20 seconds. If he connected to an ally, 50% and scaling of the healing received to either one would be reciprocated to the other. If cast to an enemy, 50% of scaling of the damage one takes would also be inflicted to the other. Its icon was for a while used to display blue buff's effect. His W would be an AoE spell called the Circle of Ancestors. It deals damage to enemies and healed allies inside the circle it created. Similar to his Q, it was used as the red buff icon for some time. His E was a point and click silence that lasted 4 seconds and scaled up to 6 seconds. This makes even Morgana's skill look reasonable. By its description, it soothed an enemy unit, making it unwilling to participate in combat. The target was then unable to attack or cast spells. Its icon would be recycled to be Trindamir's W for some time, and his ultimate, Soul Drain, was a channel spell that affected a single enemy, draining his HP and giving it to Tabu. It was basically if Swain's ultimate only worked on a single target. And just like the others, this one's icon also got reused, as it was Baron's debuff for a while. Altogether, it seems like he suffered a bit of an identity crisis, as he was a squishy enchanter that was forced to get close to the enemies to actually be useful, which is very counterintuitive. It's either be tanky and jump in the fight, or be squishy and stay back, not a little bit of both. The last part of the Easter egg was Gavid, the Plant King. It's actually not clear whether he was called Gavid or Gaud, but I'll stick to the first name as it is easier to pronounce. He lived in Demacia and formed a quickly expanding jungle with his friends. When the Demacians noticed his size, they began to cut it down, leaving the Plant King as the sole survivor. He swore revenge on humanity and joined the Immortal War. Just like the other two coffin inhabitants, he was developed in beta and cancelled because he didn't fit in the game. His issue was mostly visuals, as the artists didn't find his looks cool enough. And once again, his kit was interesting and unique, but in this case, it was an inspiration for someone. His passive might sound familiar, as it spawned a small vine around him every 2 seconds. This is what all of his abilities would then revolve around. Another part of his passive was that melee champions striking these vines would get damaged. His Q, called Animate Torrent Spitter, consumed a single vine, creating a plant that fired torrents at nearby enemies. These would last up to 30 seconds and would be immune to magic damage. Anime Entangler would also consume a vine, but this time it would create an area in which enemies would get rooted and damaged. Its icon was used as Baron's tentacle knockup for some time. His E Anime Vitalis was interesting as it consumed a vine as well, but this time it would heal an ally every 3 seconds. Its icon got used for green buff. Yes, that used to be a thing. So you might think that his abilities were quite strong, but his ultimate is the cherry on top of the cake. Gavid rooted himself and healed a portion of his max health. He then immediately generated 7 additional vines and reduced the time it takes to generate more. Furthermore, he would also enhance his next ability used, similar to Heimerdinger's ultimate. This nicely shows the duality of Riot at the time, as they were still finding their ground in the design space. Some champions had the most basic kits possible, while others would be broken even by today's standards. His overall plant team and certain abilities strongly influenced Zyra, despite being said that she was developed separately. If we keep looking around the harrowing cliff a little bit, we encounter yet another unreleased champion. Urf the Manatee first appeared as an April Fool's joke, but stuck around because the players loved him. The adorable sea creature even had his own lore, stating that despite him being from a peaceful nation, he always wanted to be a League champion. His inspiration was Jax, because he was so skilled that League only allows him to use a lamppost, a chicken's foot, a spatula and a fishing rod as his weapon, and because he likes little kids. So Urf equipped himself with 2 symbols of the Manatee heritage, a fish and spatula, and so began his journey as League's first Manatee champion, hoping to one day cross paths with his hero Jax. A true legend was in the making. But what happened next left everyone startled. The Earth Day on April Fool's 2010 took a tragic turn as our hero was swimming along and guarding the Summoner's Rift River when a creature attacked him from the jungle. What followed were doleful screams of a manatee done wrong. In the end, the only thing that was left was the poor guy's skin, and even that got taken by the creature. It was of course Warwick, who is to this day seen wearing his skin, just to remind us of his evil capabilities. Despite being responsible for it, Warwick isn't the only one profiting off of the accident. Nami and Tam Kench both have a skin that resembles him, while Fisherman Fizz and Corky ride him to battle. And so, Urf the Manatee's final resting place is the skin section of the store. But despite his sudden death, Riot did actually toy around with the kit, and even the idea of including him in the game. His passive, called Big Blue Watery Road, just made him faster in water, so dude was literally everything Reversion wants to be. His Q had an incredibly unique mechanic, as you were able to switch between a fish and a spatula, adapting to the needs of your team. The first dealt damage over time, while a hit with a spatula meant instant damage. Also it is called Flippy Floppy. Taking a sharp left turn, his W was everything but interesting and fair, as it just removed Fog of War. It goes without saying how broken having that as an ability would be, especially in higher reloads. His E kept up with his dynamic kit, as it was the only ability that actually made sense for a Manatee. Flop Strike required him to stand next to an enemy in order to flop onto him with a massive destructive force. It was probably like Zack's ultimate, but only jumping once. And finally, Omni Splash would bring forth a destructive deluge of water, dealing damage to and slowing nearby enemies. But his influence doesn't end here, as I'm sure the majority of you know the initials URF as Ultra Rapid Fire, but it was none other than a Manatee that was responsible for it. On April 1st, 2014, Riot premiered one of the community's favorite game modes in honor of one of the most wholesome champions. Ultra Rapid Fire ended up being so popular that Riot re-added it in the pool of rotating game modes in 2019, where it remains until today. Despite being slightly behind, Urf just wanted to fit in, but something that didn't fit in from the start was the Ink Mage. Even Meddler admitted that this was one of their craziest ideas ever. First talked about on the Beyond the Rift podcast, the Ink Mage would cast spells by the user drawing with their cursor. For easier representation, this is how Okami handles the mechanic. The game pauses, and you can use your cursor to draw lines, after which your character responds with a fitting attack. There is obviously a problem translating this into League of Legends, as you don't have the time to draw up these shapes, especially under stressful situations. This is why the champion felt overwhelming and was eventually cancelled. Mr. Meddler was quite secretive in sharing any more ideas, so we don't have any sketches to go off of, but it would most likely function best as a support, because the role has a bit less actions per minute compared to others. That is, you don't last hit, there is a lot of roaming around and warding. A lot of things about him did sound extremely cool, but they were better on paper than in game. Another champion that was better on paper, or should I say with paper, was the Paper Mage. The champion first entered the public eye when Ezreal responded to a fan concept called the Rune Mage. He praised it, but also mentioned that Riot was already working on a champion similar to that. The Paper Mage was this educated librarian that manipulated words in combat. I didn't find this interaction cool enough, so they reworked it into a Rune Mage that would manipulate runes and spells to hurt enemies. Perhaps the best way to imagine him is to draw a parallel with Qiyana, as she switches her element based on their terrain. The Rune Mage would most likely be based entirely on this concept, but he would be able to switch between runes even seamlessly. Despite them being serious and dedicated to the otherwise fun idea, it wasn't clear enough what the concept sets out to be. Firstly, it was confusing for the fans to know where exactly his powers come from, and secondly, even harder for Riot to make a librarian nerd look and play cool compared to others. Something like a vampire or an assassin is a lot cooler than a librarian or a guy with runes. There were just too many issues on top of each other, so Riot decided to scrap him completely and leave Ryze to remain the only real rune enjoyer. While little is known about the mages, even less is known about the Iron Engineer. The only confirmation of Riot working on him is some concept art from Oggy Pagan. He worked on many of the designs in the early stages of the game. Nothing other than the artwork ever surfaced, but we can safely assume that he turned into blitzcrank, or maybe even a rumble. But the first one is more likely, as Oggy also worked on a concept called Golem. It was just an early blitzcrank. But not only did he work on blitzcrank's predecessor, he also worked on Olaf's. The axe-swinging maniac was originally meant to yield a bow, which was a waste of his chadness. He also had an eagle that would cooperate with him. Olaf eventually received his axes to go better with his design, while the arrows and eagle got re-explored in Queen's design. Another concept that ended up inspiring a present champion was Avasha, the Vampire Blades Maiden. As with the previous two, the only thing that surfaced was a sketch of her, but writers did confirm that she was inspired by Riven. Now she is also heavily inspired by Marth and Cloudstrife, so there is most definitely space for someone as cool as Avasha, even in today's champion pool. So the opposite, a character that wouldn't fit in the champions pool at any point in time, is Blackblade, the Adventurer. He was developed in the game's alpha version and discovered in its files in March 2009, so we can safely assume he was the first cancelled champion. It's fine, because we all have to start somewhere, but Rob probably isn't a character that I can proudly look back on. He has the most generic design possible, like, if you look in the dictionary under generic, I guarantee this guy would pop up. As an old champion, he obviously didn't have any significant lore, but he was meant to be this brave traveler that doesn't fear anything and carries way too many pouches. Despite his extremely basic style, his kit is actually where he shines as a concept. Well, at least in everything other than his passive. It doesn't have an official description, but it was called Liberate. We have to keep in mind that passives back then were mainly there for the sake of it, so it would most likely be something like Rob gains 3% crit chance every level. His Q, Gutbuster, allowed him to throw a knife at his target, dealing damage. If it performed a critical hit, its damage would be multiplied by 3. It is quite likely that this later became Shaco's Q. His W allowed him to go invincible and gain 5% movement speed, which is exactly like Twitch's Q. They even share the name Ambush. It would work best in a combination with Vital Blow, as if Rob was invincible, the enemy on the receiving end of his E would get stunned for a short duration of time. Otherwise, the target would only get put to sleep. His ultimate is where it would get crazy, as it made all his attacks be crits for the next 5, scaling up to 11 seconds. The age-old saying of don't judge a book by its cover really applies here, as Rob might not look the most original or cool, but his kit might be one of the most fun to play ones ever made. Furthermore, he was also most likely the first champion that had invisibility, which was later quickly passed on to Twitch and Shaco, but he was also the first one to have a sleep spell, which did not make it into the game all the way until Zoe was released. It seems like Robin was ready to be shipped, as he even had his voice lines in 3D models, but writers decided to pull the plug. Blackblade was pulled because he didn't fit in with the game's artistic team, and the design team didn't get any inspiration from him. His place in the development cycle was later given to Udyr, so luckily we did eventually receive someone fun. League's champion designs have ups and downs, but we should be grateful for Riot innovating and trying their best to keep the game interesting for so long. As with any creative works, all ideas are good, but only a select few are good enough to be finalized and presented. Was there a design that you would like to see brought back to life? Let me know in the comments, I'm always happy to discuss. With all said, the iceberg only gets deeper.